This is a rotating dog I made using Cinema 4D Lite, which is a free plugin that comes bundled with After Effects. It's the stripped-down cousin of Cinema 4D, which is a fairly fully featured 3D software. Cinema 4D and Cinema 4D Lite are generally used for motion graphics more so than character animation. Especially Cinema 4D Lite, considering its key drawback is that it doesn't give you the ability to rig puppets, which makes it bad for character animation. But everything else it's quite good at. So in this video I'm going to go through the steps necessary to download and import models, apply texture to them, apply simple animation to them, and then to animate the camera moving through your 3D scene. Switch. Okay. So I'm going to start a new project just so everything's clear and we're starting from scratch. So I'll create a new project. And once you're there, the first thing you need to do is create a new Cinema 4D file. And this is the Cinema 4D file that After Effects is going to look at. So that's under New, Maxon Cinema 4D file. And this is going to give us a dialog box asking us where to save it. So this is important. It's good to save your Cinema 4D file into the same place as your After Effects project, because it's just like any other asset. If it gets moved relative to your After Effects file, you'll have to tell After Effects where it went. So to keep it simple, I like to keep it in the same folder as my After Effects project. So once you've created your Cinema 4D file, after a moment it will appear in the project panel. It'll also open up a blank window in Cinema 4D. Let's just do a quick test so we can tell if After Effects is seeing it properly. I'm going to click this button to create a new cube in the center of the screen, and then I'm going to click Save. Now every time you click Save, you should then be able to check in After Effects by double-clicking on your Cinema 4D project layer in the project panel. You should see a window into Cinema 4D. You should see the same thing in After Effects that you were looking at in Cinema 4D. Let's see here. If I double click on it, there, we see the cube, just like in Cinema 4D. So back in Cinema 4D, the first thing we'll want to do is to import another model. So I've been using this website, TF3DM. It has a lot of free 3D models, including this amazing Chernobyl room, which would indicate that there was some sort of like incognito heist going on during the Chernobyl meltdown, when in fact no, it was just some people pushing some buttons wrong, and I guess nuclear fusion is really hard. But anyway, this is an amazing asset, so I hope you'll use it. But anyway, this website is full of 3D models. You can search for whatever you want. And there are lots of different types of 3D model indicated by this little suffix. This is .c4d. There's also .3ds, .obj, .fbx. And not all of these work. Some ones that certainly do are .c4d, .obj, and .fbx. All work pretty well. Many of them don't. I can't list them all offhand, but a little trial and error will let you know. I'm going to go back into Cinema 4D and import a model I'd already downloaded. In this case, it's a dog. So you can do that in a couple of ways, but I'll just go to Open under the File menu. So here we have a dog model that I downloaded from this website. And it usually comes with a billion files. Like, for example, this is the skin of the dog. So I'm going to import the obj file because I know that's safe. And that's just the raw geometry with no textures or anything on it. So once you've imported that, it'll give us the option to choose how large it is. This is often a fairly arbitrary thing. I'm just going to choose 10 centimeters because that seems big enough. And there is the dog. So you'll note this is deceptive. This will not show up in After Effects because you'll see up at the top of the screen this is an entirely new Cinema 4D project. This is not the Cinema 4D project that After Effects is looking at. So the trick here is to select everything and copy and paste it into the Cinema 4D file that After Effects is looking at. So you can do that over here on the right side of the screen. There's this window. This is similar to the project panel in After Effects. This is where all your stuff is. So in here I can select everything and I'm going to Command C to copy it. And now we need to bring it into the Cinema 4D project that After Effects is looking at. So in order to get that, I'm going to go back into After Effects and find that Cinema 4D file in the project panel. And from here you can open that in Cinema 4D by clicking Edit and clicking Edit Original. You end up doing this a lot, so I use the keyboard shortcut Command E. But that will open up the Cinema 4D project file in Cinema 4D. So it's asking us if we want to save the dog project file. There's no need to do that. So here we are back at the cube. This is this After Effects project file. I'm sorry, this is the Cinema 4D project file that After Effects is looking at. So I'm going to delete the cube, and in here I'm going to click Command V to paste the dog, which interestingly comes in very small. So that brings us to our first tip. You can scale it up by holding the 5 key on your keyboard and clicking and dragging either of these arrows, and that will gradually scale it up. So that's about, I don't know, about dog size. So there are some navigational tools I'll point out now. I mentioned the 5 key, but all the numbers 1 through 6 kind of do things when you hold them down and click. So if you hold down 1 and click and drag, you'll move around your 3D scene. If you hold down 2 and click and drag, you'll zoom in or out onto whatever you've clicked on. So you can go right into the dog's eyeball. 3 will rotate around whatever you click on. So here we're rotating around the dog's eye. So the 4, 5, and 6 buttons change what the object is doing. So if I click 4 and click on the object, I can move it around. And these red, blue, and green arrows indicate motion on the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis specifically. So if you want specific control, you can click on these arrows individually to move the dog along a specific axis. 5, I mentioned before, is scaling. And 6, I believe, is rotation. So if you hold 6 down and click and drag the dog, you'll get all this rotation happening. So I'm going to click Save so that we can check our dog is visible in After Effects. So if we wait a moment for it to update, you will see that yes, our dog is visible in After Effects. So the next thing I want to show you is to texture. So going back into Cinema 4D, you can see that the dog is this flat, matte texture. We can change that. So I'm going to navigate to the folder where the dog's texture is. In this case, the dog's texture came with the dog. So we can find it here. It's this thing that looks like dog skin. If you drag that into this window down here, you will import it as a texture. Let me show you what that means. So it'll ask if you want to move the image into the project search path, and click yes. That'll move a copy of image next to your Cinema 4D project file. So this window down here are the textures that are being applied to your image. So the texture is simply something that wraps around the image. So you can click and drag any texture you want from down here onto your geometry, and it will apply that texture to the geometry. So in this case, we now have our textured dog. So I'm going to bring in one more object. In this case, I'll bring in plants, just to drive this technique home. I'm going to save, and then I'm going to File, Open. I'm going to go to this other model I downloaded. In this case, it's a flower. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to import this .obj file. And I'll choose 10 centimeters as an acceptable size. And here we have our plant. So now I can select the plant, copy it with Command C, and then again I'm going to go back into After Effects, and I'm going to click on the project file, in the project panel, and I'm going to go to Edit, Edit Original. That will open the Cinema 4D file in After Effects. So now again we're looking at the Cinema 4D file that After Effects is also looking at. And I'm going to paste the plant in there. So in this case, 10 centimeters, for whatever reason, has created a huge plant. Not a big deal. I'm just going to scale it down. This will happen all the time. That seems maybe more reasonable. Cool. So now we have a dog and a plant in the same scene, which is everything I've always wanted. There are a million ways to animate things in CGI, but most of them are rather labor-intensive and unfun. So let's stick now to this thing called the deformer, which you can create under object. I'm sorry, create and then deformer. And there's a lot to choose from, and they're all super fun. I'll just choose twist for now. Essentially what this does is it creates like a vortex in which your object is messed up. So if you click twist, you'll see it appear here in your Cinema 4D project window, and it manifests as like an invisible box in which crazy shit happens. So if you surround your dog with your box, and then the final step, you need to apply that twist field to the dog itself, and you do that by clicking on it here in the project panel and dragging it and dropping it on top of the layer you want to apply it to. In this case, it's the dog body. You'll know it's good to drop when you've got that down facing arrow. So now it's applied. So down here, this window is like the equivalent of the After Effects window. So this is where we tweak the effect itself. In this case, changing the angle will show you what it does. It will, in this particular deformer, the dog gets twisted into a corkscrew. So there are lots of these to play with, and you can pile them one on top of another to create really weird animation. Additionally, you can also keyframe this, similar to in After Effects. So I'll start off at 0, You see this circle next to each parameter. That's the equivalent of the stopwatch in After Effects. That both turns on animation and drops keyframes for the values at the current point in the timeline. So if I click this, that does two things. It turns on animation and it also drops a keyframe in the timeline for this particular parameter at 0. If I were to move, for example, later into the timeline, and then change the parameter, so you'll see that the keyframe thingy turns yellow but not red. That's a fundamental difference between Cinema 4D and After Effects. After Effects by default drops a keyframe whenever you change the value of an animated layer parameter, but in this case it doesn't. So changing the value hasn't dropped a keyframe. We have to drop it ourselves by clicking again on the stopwatch, and then we get the red inner circle, which indicates that okay, there's a keyframe there. You can also see the keyframes in the timeline. There are these little notches here. But now the dog will animate between those two parameters. So, last thing, if you're making a bunch of animation and you find that your timeline... Scratch that. Okay. So, similar to the way you can keyframe effects, you could keyframe basic things like position. If I were to click back on the dog body and click on the coordinates tab here, you can see these points correlate to its position. So to have the dog move across the screen, for example, I would correlate these 3 points of position. I would keyframe them, move the dog out, and then move the dog across the screen. And you can see then that I forgot to set the keyframe. So once I've moved the dog out across the screen, I'm going to set these such that they're red. And now it's moving across. So if you've made a bunch of animation and you find that your composition isn't long enough, you can change it using this number here. So in this case it's 300 frames, but let's say it's not enough and we want it to be 400. You could change that number, and then you'll see there's more timeline to work with. So now you've got a bunch of objects in here and some animation applied. Now let me show you how to move the camera through the scene, which is done in After Effects. So back in After Effects, we have the opportunity to animate a camera moving through our 3D scene inside of After Effects. I generally do this inside of After Effects instead of Cinema 4D, just so I can leave the Cinema 4D camera for arranging my models and checking my textures and whatever. So the first step here in After Effects is to create a new camera, which I'll do under the Layer menu by clicking Layer, New, Camera. We'll get a complicated looking dialog box, but all I really worry about here is this preset option, and you can choose the focal length of the camera you want. So 35mm is pretty standard, 50mm is a little bit more cinematic, portrait-like, 80mm is like a telephoto lens looking at a safari, 28, 24 would be very wide, very stark. So I'm going to choose 35 as a good standard. And then the rest of the settings just kind of fall into place when you choose your preset. So you can click OK. And by default nothing happens, and this is for the reason that we need to tell the Cinema 4D layer specifically to look through the After Effects camera that we just made. So to do that, let's select it, and in the Effects Controls window, which might be hidden behind your project window, always important to check, and again, if you can't find it, just go under Window and click here, Effects Controls. That will bring it to the front wherever it is. So this option here for camera, by default it's set to Cinema 4D camera, which of course here is not what we want, so we can change it here to composition camera, which you'll see will go blank because our composition camera currently is off somewhere in the distance. Let me show you, for the sake of demonstration, that I can move this camera around and find my scene. Make it fucking easy for interacting. So let's move it. There's one quirk with the After Effects camera that I always take steps to override, and that is the After Effects camera always points in the same direction unless you tell it otherwise. So if you move it around an object, it will always be pointing at the object in the middle, which is generally not how I like it to work. I like it to stay facing the same direction while I move it, as if I were holding it. So in order to override that, we're going to do something called parenting. We're going to take the camera and we're going to parent it to a null object, which is essentially just a blank object that does nothing but control other objects. So you can think of this as taking the camera and tying it to a stick so that we can hold the camera by the stick and move it around. So I'll create a new null object under that same layer menu, layer, new, null object. And again, this is an object that just, it's invisible. All it does is control other objects. And then I'm going to tie the camera to it, which you do using this parent layer. And you can think of this as like a leash here. I'm taking the leash from the camera and attaching it to the null object. So now the null object has control over the camera, and wherever I move the null object, the camera will go also. So now we can use the null object's position property to move the camera around. There's one more thing we need to do, and that's make the null object a 3D layer, because right now the null object is 2D. It's living in a flat 2D world, and the camera is a 3D object moving in 3D space. So in order to change the null object to also be a 3D layer, there's this little three-dimensional cube checkbox here, and once we click that, then the null object will become a 3D layer like the camera, and we're given an extra dimension to move it around in space. So here comes the task of moving it around until you find your 3D scene. So I'm gonna zoom out using the Z So once you've turned your null object into a 3D layer, you can see that you now have 3 coordinate points. These refer to X, 640, Y, 400, and Z, 0. And those refer to the axes in 3D space. So we have this green Y up-down axis. So the Y number correlates to how up or down the camera is. Then we have this red X axis, which refers to how left or right the camera is, and there's this blue Z axis that we can't really see. That refers to how far or close the camera is. So I'm going to move the Z axis further out until I can find my scene. And now I'm moving it according to the y-axis just to dial in closer. Okay, now I've found my scene. So this 3D camera can now be keyframed like anything else in After Effects. So this is how I'm going to do my camera move. Let's say this is the starting point of my camera move. I'm going to drop a position keyframe here on the camera, and then I'll move it out further into the timeline. And now let's zoom into the dog's face really close and dramatically. So I'm moving the Z value in order to bring the camera closer to the dog. And then I'll move the Y position up. So this will now give me a camera move from the first frame here you can see the camera is now animated, zooming in close to the dog from far away. Those are the essential activities of using Cinema 4D Lite and by proxy any 3D software. Cinema 4D Lite having the advantage of being able to merge with After Effects like this. So the last step before you render from, so you can render this from After Effects like you normally would, but you want to make sure for one last step to make sure, so you can render this from After Effects like you normally would, but the last thing you want to do before you do so is to make sure that the Cineware plugin is set to render the final quality. By default it will be set on software, which will render all your wireframes and your lights and your cameras, which may or may not be what you want. I generally switch it to standard final, which is sort of a more high quality version of your render. But once you've got that set up, you can just render it as you would normally from After Effects. Cool, that's it.